All right, we just saw how we can use parameters in our functions. Let's try that out in some actual code. We're actually going to start with the same function we were using at the end of the last module when we were talking about functions. So I've got this getInitial function. You pass in a name. It retrieves the first character of that name, converts it to uppercase, stores that, and then returns it to whatever called that function. And if you look at my program itself, I ask somebody for their name, and then I call the function and say, hey, they just gave me a name. Please give me back the initial for that name, store it, and print it on the screen. So just to show what's happening here, let's just call that code. GetInitials function.py. There we go. It asked me for my first name. Even if I type it in lowercase, it comes back and says your initial is S and returns it in uppercase. But what if, and I think that makes a lot of sense if I'm trying to generate user IDs, might be based on someone's initials, always uppercase, but if I'm using it to generate an email address, maybe I don't always want it to be flipped into uppercase. So let's add a second parameter. Let's call it force uppercase. And now what we'll do is we'll say, hey, when I call this, if force uppercase is true, now that's a Boolean variable, so I don't have to say equals true. I just say if force uppercase. We learned this in the module on conditions. Then let's return the initial in uppercase. But if they didn't, then let's return the initial, but not convert it into uppercase. So if they give it to me uppercase, it'll be uppercase. If they give it to me lowercase, it comes back in lowercase. Doesn't matter. So now, but because I've added a second parameter to the function, that means every time I call it, I have to make sure I pass in a second parameter. So here, where I call it, I have to pass in a value true or false. Let's actually pass in a false this time. So this time, if I pass in my name in lowercase, it should give me back the initial in lowercase. So I pass in false, and I run the code again, and oh, I made a typo. Oh, I forgot. Syntax errors, they're always going to happen. This one gets me all the time. I forgot to put the colon after the word else in my if statement. So let's just run that again. And it says enter my first name, Susan, and it returns an initial of S. So we said don't force it into uppercase, so now we have that control. I can get it back in uppercase or lowercase. I decide when I call the function which one I want back. So more control of my code. Now another neat thing you can do is you can specify a default value. So if I say, let's assume they want it back in uppercase if they don't tell me otherwise. If I just make that change and call the program again, I can still pass in a value for force uppercase. So I can still say, no, I don't want it to force it to uppercase. So I pass in a value of false. And sure enough, when I run it, if I pass in my name in lowercase, it returns the initial in lowercase. But because I specified a default value, I have the choice of not passing a value for uppercase at all. So I could just pass in the first name and then say, hey, forced uppercase, you've got a default value for that. Just use that. So in that case, now whenever I call it, and I pass in my name in lowercase letters, it says, oh, you didn't give me a value for forced uppercase, so I'm going to use that default of true. And when it's true, I always return the initial in uppercase. So you'll notice it comes back and gives me back the initial in uppercase. So default values, it said, great. It makes it easier for other people to call your code. The other thing I mentioned was the fact that we can use named notation when passing in parameters. So I can, when I'm calling this, I could actually say force uppercase equals false, and first name equals, or a name equals first name. By default, when you call a function, it assumes that the first value you pass in goes in the first parameter, the second one goes in the second parameter, so on. But when you use a named notation, it achieves two things. It makes your code easier to read, and it means you can pass in the parameters in any order. So in this case, you can see, even though I pass in the name in lowercase letters, it returns it in lowercase because I said to use force uppercase set to false. So named parameters, or name notation, is a neat way of calling the functions to make it a little easier for others to read.